Everybody thinks that Fallout 4 nails the 1950s aesthetic. But what if I told you that Bethesda actually used the wrong architecture? That in reality, Sanctuary Hills is not about conformity. It's about rebellion, innovation, and a forgotten experiment in American design.
Architectural Outcast.
Randy here from the Architectural Outcast. Architecture is storytelling. Now, it's not a novel, it's abstract and symbolic, much more akin to poetry and songwriting. It's one of the reasons why architecture is often referred to as frozen music. A work of architecture tells its story through its form, its shape, its style, its aesthetic choices, and its materiality, what it's made out of. Often overlooked, but equally important part of an architecture's storytelling is its purpose, its function, and its history. For example, architects will often use classicism, references to ancient Greece and Rome, when they want to symbolize tradition, culture, self-governance, individualism. At the other end of the spectrum, you have mega projects, massive works of architecture that symbolize progress, science and technology, and what humans can accomplish when they work together. However, very few architects are willing to combine classicism with a mega project because that has a very specific history that no one wants to be associated with. Well, maybe the Pentagon. You ignore a work of architecture's purpose, use, and history at your own peril. Fallout 4 begins its narrative before the bombs fall. We're introduced to a small family, husband and wife along with their newborn son, and they live in a 1950s-inspired home. This home is located in Sanctuary Hills, a pre-planned community made up of variations on the same metal house provided by the government for veterans and their families. Bethesda gets it right. They nail the 1950s aesthetic. From the neighborhood, the architecture, the interior design, the fashions, all the way to the Philco Predictica TV. Personally, I find it amusing that it turns out the Philco Predictica predicted the future of TV design. The 1950s aesthetic is a key component of the world building because it is fundamental to the storytelling. Using 1950s suburban America as a metaphor for imposed conformity and repression that ultimately leads to individual isolation and self-destruction isn't anything new. Jack Kerouac and his fellow beat writers were making this same criticism in the 1950s. But then again, you don't play Bethesda games for their groundbreaking storytelling. Now, I'm not here to criticize Bethesda storytelling. Well, to be honest, I am criticizing Bethesda storytelling, but indirectly. Y'all see, Bethesda's chosen the wrong architecture to tell that story. They've confused and mashed together two separate historic events. Pre-planned communities, which do fit Bethesda's narrative, and prefab metal homes, which are not only the wrong architecture, they're diametrically opposed to Bethesda's storytelling. In 1946, America found itself in a housing crisis. For the previous 20 years, the Great Depression and World War II, very few new houses had been built. The existing housing stock was aging. It was wearing out, and the population hadn't stopped growing over the last 20 years. There wasn't enough housing to go around. People were living on top of each other. It was all bursting at the seams, which was causing the housing to wear out even faster. During the war, the government couldn't afford to pay American soldiers very much, so they cut a deal. They promised to pay them back once the war had been won. We got the GI Bill, which guaranteed that veterans would be able to afford to buy their own home. In 1946, there was one major flaw in this clever plan. There weren't any homes available, no matter the price. So America does what America does best. It got to work. It used the same industrial might that won World War II to start cranking out new homes. By 1950, pre-planned suburbs, chock-a-block full of identical little houses, like the various Levitt towns, were beginning to circle every major American city. These pre-planned communities are the origins of our perceptions of suburban life. The wholesome all-American family, husband and wife, 2 kids, 1.5 dogs, their little house with its white picket fence, carpools, block parties, opening presents under the Christmas tree. These same suburbs are also the origins of a lot of our negative connotations with the 1950s. They were safe, a little too safe. They were all the same, a little too identical. They were banal and bland, leading to stagnation. Over time, the suburbs were becoming oppressive. They were imposing conformity by destroying individuality, which led to self-destructive behavior. The dark underbelly of post-war suburbia is on display in Sanctuary Hills. When you return and you find the neighborhood in ruins and you start looting all the houses for supplies, you discover that everything was a facade, that all your neighbors were either criminals, drug addicts, or degenerates. It's subtle, but another aspect of this dark underbelly is that Sean, the baby, is being raised by a robot. A common criticism from all sides of the political spectrum is that 1950s suburban families outsource their parenting, either to a nanny or more often, the TV. As I talked about with my critique of Oblivion, I'll link the playlist if y'all are interested in checking out those videos. But as I talked about in Oblivion, when it comes to world building, architecture will often do the heavy lifting for you. It will tell you all sorts of things about the world without you having to go into lengthy explanations. The critique of post-war America is so well established that anytime we see a 1950s suburban neighborhood, our mind immediately goes to both its positive associations and its dark underbelly. As I said, Bethesda's walking well-trod ground here, so it's easy to understand the mistake they made. Mass-produced identical suburbs led to all sorts of bad stuff, so therefore, mass-produced identical metal houses equal more of the same. The problem is, they couldn't have been more wrong if they'd tried. The homes that we see in Sanctuary Hills are inspired by one of the more fascinating footnotes in American architectural history, the Lustron Homes. We have to go back to the housing crisis at the end of World War II. The government is pumping large sums of money into home ownership, but there aren't any homes to be had no matter the price. A number of companies, the most famous being Lustron, came up with a bright idea. We have all these factories that have been making metal stuff for the war. Well, why don't we use them and their expertise to make houses out of metal? They took a page from companies like Sears and Montgomery Ward. You'd buy a piece of property, put your foundation, have your utilities installed, and then on a given date, your house kit would arrive. The difference was that Sears and Montgomery Ward houses were very traditional. Traditional styles, traditional materials, traditional construction methods that took an entire construction crew weeks or even months to put together. On the other hand, Lustron homes were made entirely out of enameled metal. They were futuristic and state-of-the-art, offering all the latest modern amenities, and they were meant to be built by 3 people with minimal building experience over 2 or 3 days. Pretty cool idea, right? So why aren't we all living in metal houses? Why did Lustron only sell roughly 2,500 houses and all the other metal house companies combined another 2,500 houses? An all-metal house costs more per square foot than a house of equivalent size in these new post-war suburbs. But in 46, 47, 48, those suburbs didn't exist yet. You couldn't buy a new house no matter the price. A potential homeowner had 2 choices. They could go on a waiting list, and at some point in the future, they would be eligible to buy a house. Or they could order a house, and in months have it delivered. And assuming they'd done all the proper prep work, within days of the house being delivered, they could be living in it. When you're the only game in town, price doesn't matter. But by 1950, Lustron was offering a solution to a problem that no longer existed. Nobody, including everybody in the building industry, expected America would be able to crank out as many new houses as fast as they did. Now potential homeowners had two very different choices. They could go on a waiting list and in a couple of months move into their brand new house, or they could order a kit to be delivered in a couple of months where they then had to build their new house. Then there was the financial considerations. To buy a house in these new suburbs, you needed one loan, but to build a Lustron home, you needed at minimum two loans, one for the land and the other for the kit. Then there was the final nail in Lustron's coffin, that foundation and utilities that had to be installed before you could build the house. The foundation was just a slab on grade, not that difficult. Most homeowners could do that if they wanted, but the utilities required a plumber and electrician. The same plumbers and electricians that were off building those new suburbs. You could be waiting over a year for a contractor to fit you into their schedule. The more things change, the more they stay the same. This gets back to the mistake that Bethesda made in Fallout 4. There is no Sanctuary Hills, a suburb made entirely of Lustron homes in our world. Lustron homes were scattered all over the United States. That's because the mass-produced cookie-cutter suburbs like the various Levitt towns and the Lustron homes were catering to two very different clienteles, two very different homeowners. The post-war suburbs don't look the way they do by accident. The people designing and building them were very specific in the type and style of houses they chose to build. It was what most Americans wanted. Because of the hardships and horrors of the Great Depression and World War II, Americans had become sentimental around ideas of home and family, which led to very clear ideas of what type of house they wanted. Most Americans wanted a house that was anchored in American history and that would facilitate social and cultural traditions. One of the unintended consequences of all this, builders, in their attempt to quickly build as many houses as possible, started to limit your choices, the types of houses you could pick from, causing the suburbs to start to look the same, something that the critics have been harping on ever since. What a lot of critics overlook is that the people in 1950 weren't stupid. They knew what trade-offs they were accepting. But for a lot of Americans, having the opportunity to own a house that looked the way they wanted and that would facilitate the lifestyle they wanted, rooted in culture and tradition, was worth the price of having their neighbor's house and the one across the street and the one next to it and those two around the corner to look the same as their house. However, there are always contradictory voices, and for a lot of Americans, the last thing they wanted to do was live in a house that was identical to everybody else's. They wanted something unique and different that would allow them to stand out. This is where Lustron Homes comes in. I mean, they're made out of metal, automatically different from everybody else, and their designs, while they had nods to tradition, were sleek and modern. Lustron's own marketing leaned into appealing to these dissident voices, to those who wanted to go against the grain, stand out, be different, be individuals. I make the argument that had the American building industry been a little bit slower and there not been the bottleneck with contractors, that Lustron would have been around for years. If for nothing else, they sold difference. And I haven't even gotten into the relevance for American culture, the symbolism of a pioneer going out and claiming a piece of land and then building a home for your family with your own two hands. If y'all aren't picking up on what I'm saying here, Lustron Homes are a fascinating blending of what are often considered to be contradictory American impulses: self-reliance, rugged individualism, focus on traditional family values, fascination with technology, and an excited optimism about the future. And then along comes Bethesda, who tries to shoehorn Lustron Homes into a story about oppression and tyranny, where the architecture is supposed to symbolize enforced conformity, which leads to the loss of individualism.
And you thought that was a good idea?
Personally, I've always had a problem with the traditional criticisms of the 1950s. I've always believed that things were a lot more complicated than they're often portrayed. And I think that Lustron Homes are symbolic of that complexity and often contradictions of that era. After the hardships and horrors of the Great Depression and World War II, America did want to return to a more traditional culture, but they were excited and optimistic about the future. They were both skeptical and fascinated with technology. There was this urge for conformity as well as a celebration of individualism. I think it's telling that despite all the critical finger wagging about imposed conformity, 1950s American culture saw an almost unprecedented cultural explosion. And that explosion, no pun intended, wasn't just happening in science and technology. It was going on in art and music and literature. Shoot, 3/4 of the entertainment industry is still living off of what was created in the 1950s. In fact, you could make the argument, it's one I'd make, that most of modern entertainment is just derivative of what was created in the 1950s. At any rate, I hope I've given y'all something to think about, and until next time, y'all be safe. If y'all are still here, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. While you're at it, why don't you like this video, subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell. You can hear me yammer on about something else next time, and feel free to share this video far and wide.
Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment.